the remote valleys of Appalachia, where fog clings low to the ridges and silence settles heavier than stone. One family's name became a shadow that few dared to speak aloud. The Barkers were not merely poor. They were not merely isolated. They were broken, twisted by generations of blood turned inward, marked by bodies that bent in unnatural shapes and faces that carried the silent testimony of forbidden unions. Their story is not one of monsters born from myth but of human beings abandoned to hunger, shame, and a darkness that would follow them from cradle to grave. This is the tragic tale of the Barker Bloodline, a family whose deformities and despair were buried as deeply as the mountains they called home. The Barkers lived where the land itself seemed unwilling to welcome life, a fold of the Appalachian hills, steep and rocky, where the soil was thin, where the winds funneled through like a whisper of death. Their cabin stood crooked at the edge of a hollow, its boards warped, its chimney leaning like a broken spine. At first glance, it was only poverty, but those who lived nearby knew better. Poverty was common in Appalachia, but what clung to the Barkers was something else, something darker. The first stories began long before the children of the Hollow had been born. Whispers said a Barker ancestor had chosen blood over the outside world. A brother and sister joined in shame when no one else would have them. Others claimed it was a father who refused to let his daughter leave, keeping her locked away, declaring her his own. However it began, the truth was written not in words, but in flesh. Their children bore it. Faces stretched in unnatural symmetry, eyes set too close or too far apart. Hands with fingers curled inward, like roots twisted in the soil. Their gait was slow, uncertain, as though every step was a burden placed on bones that no longer fit together as they should. Neighbors looked away. They always did. To stare at a Barker child was to invite dread into the heart, and yet the memory of their faces lingered long after the eyes had turned aside. A crooked smile, a heavy brow, the sound of slurred words forming prayers no one else could understand. They were human, yes, but they were also a reminder of what happens when blood turns upon itself, generation after generation. Without relief, inside the Barker cabin, shame and secrecy ruled. The windows were rarely open, and the smoke that rose from the chimney carried with it a smell different from the rest of the valley, musty, sour, heavy. Candles burned at all hours, their wax pooling into rivers on the rough-hewn table. The air was thick with dust, with damp, with a silence that seemed to complete. Outside, the hills echoed with birdsong and rushing creeks, but within those walls, time stood still, heavy as stone. The Barkers themselves hardly spoke to outsiders. When they did, their voices were strained, cracked, a strange cadence that unsettled even the kindest neighbors. Some thought it was the sound of their deformities, mouths misshapen, palates split. Others whispered it was something older, a curse riding on their tongues. The few who ventured close enough to hear it swore they never forgot. Children who strayed too near the Barker hollow spoke of shapes moving in the trees, a figure that watched but did not approach, a pale face gleaming from behind the crooked boards of the cabin wall. When they told their parents, they were scolded, but the fear in their voices was undeniable. And more than once, a mother would hush them quickly, closing shutters as though the mere mention of the name might summon the family from the shadows. Inside the bloodline, the cycle repeated. Sons grew into men with twisted limbs. Daughters bloomed into women whose features carried both beauty and distortion, their eyes bright but their faces marked, and in time they were given not to outsiders, but to their own. Brother to sister, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. It was not romance, it was survival, or at least the kind of survival they knew. To reach outside was to face rejection. To turn inward was to endure what they already were. The children that followed bore the price. Some lived, though bent and broken from birth. Some did not. Those who died were buried in shallow graves on the ridge, where the earth itself seemed reluctant to take them. Those who lived carried the blood forward, each generation more frail, more marked, more haunting, and yet, within the cabin, they loved in the only way they understood. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering lullabies no one else would hear. Fathers carved wooden toys with hands that shook, setting them into small palms that could barely grasp them. In the quiet, when no outsiders were near, they laughed strange, brittle sounds, but laughter nonetheless. They were not monsters, no matter what the valley believed. They were a family. And that is perhaps what made their tragedy deepest of all. But outside, in the wider world, their name became a curse. Barker was whispered to frighten children into obedience. Travelers were warned to avoid the hollow, to take the long way around, lest they see what should not be seen. Some spoke of demons, others of witches. Few dared to admit the truth, that the Barkers were nothing more or less than human beings, abandoned to their own silence, trapped in a cycle too deep to escape. At night, the hollow was a place of dread. The cabin stood in silhouette against the ridge, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of a beast. The forest held its breath, and those who lived nearby swore that when the wind blew just right, you could hear the cries of generations, the sobbing of daughters, the groaning of sons, the lullabies of mothers who prayed for an end that never came. This was the beginning of the Barker legacy, a family bound not by love of choice, but by love of necessity, a family whose deformities told a story their voices could not, a family buried not in the ground, but in secrecy, shame, and the silence of neighbors who turned away, and still the story deepened. For hunger is a cruel master, and isolation sharpens the edge of desperation. What the Barkers endured in the years that followed would take their tragedy from whispers into legend. Asterisk, as the years slipped like water through their calloused hands, the Barkers' deformities grew more pronounced, their bodies shaped by the relentless burden of their bloodline. It was as if each generation carved deeper scars into the flesh of the next. Children were born with backs that arched like question marks, with jaws that jutted unevenly, with eyes clouded as though the world itself was too painful to be seen clearly. Their steps shuffled, slow and uncertain, and their voices echoed oddly in the air, carrying both the innocence of childhood and the fractured echoes of something broken long before they arrived. The hollow became their prison, the forest pressed against their cabin like an iron wall, and the outside world receded farther with every passing year. What few neighbors they had stopped coming altogether, for each visit left them unsettled, heavy with the unspoken truth that the Barkers' lives were unraveling in ways no outsider could mend. Fear became the mortar that sealed the family away, and silence their only companion. Inside, candlelight flickered against warped walls. Wax dripped and hardened into stalagmites upon the table, as though even time itself had grown weary of flowing. Shadows stretched long across the boards, creating shapes that seemed alive, as if ancestors long buried still watched, condemning or protecting. No one could tell. The Barkers learned to move in that dimness, eyes accustomed to the dark, their whispers blending with the hiss of the flames. Food was scarce. The land around them was rocky and reluctant, offering little in the way of crops. What they grew was stunted, pale stalks of corn, withered beans, roots gnawed half to rot by the soil itself. Game was scarce too, for animals avoided the hollow, much like the neighbors did. Hunters swore they never saw deer tracks near the Barker land, as though even nature recoiled from that place. Hunger clung to the family like a shadow, thinning their already fragile frames, hollowing cheeks, sharpening bones against skin. And hunger, when it lingers too long, becomes desperation. There were whispers, always whispers, that the Barkers had done things no family should ever do, that a child born too weak to live became food for the others, that a traveler who strayed too near and never returned had found his end, not in accident, but in appetite. Proof was never found, Only stories carried like embers from one mouth to another. Yet in the hills of Appalachia, where superstition clung heavier than the fog, such whispers had the weight of truth. The children of the Barkers played with bones, not polished, carved toys, but real bones, bleached by time and gnawed by teeth. They clattered on the wooden floor, rolled across dirt-smudged hands, became dolls and soldiers in games no one outside could bear to watch. When strangers asked where they had found them, the Barkers smiled their crooked smiles and gave no answer. The silence was louder than any confession, and yet, despite the horror whispered about them, the family clung to love in their own way. Fathers, deformed and bent, still worked the rocky soil until their hands split and bled. Mothers rocked infants against their chests, humming songs too broken to carry a tune but still soft with tenderness. Brothers shielded sisters when outsiders stared too long. In their own closed world, love was not absent. It was only marked by deformity, as much a scar as their twisted bones. Still, the deformities deepened. One boy, neighbors remembered, was born with legs that never straightened, leaving him to crawl like an animal upon the cabin floor. A girl's jaw was set so narrow she could barely swallow broth, her cries muffled, as though her voice itself was strangled. And there were others, so many others whose bodies carried the weight of sins they had never chosen. Each birth was a gamble, each cradle a coffin waiting to be filled. The cabin itself became a living tomb. Its boards groaned with the weight of years, its roof sagged under the burden of rain and snow. The air inside was always damp, smelling of smoke and mildew, of sweat and sickness, of too many bodies pressed too close together. It was said that to step inside the Barker home was to feel the weight of generations pressing down, to hear the silence of voices long gone but never forgotten by the time outsiders spoke of them again. The Barkers had become something between myth and warning. Parents told their children not to stray near the hollow, lest the Barkers take them. Teenagers dared one another to walk past their land at night, listening for strange cries that some swore were neither animal nor human. Preachers spoke from pulpits about sin manifest in flesh, pointing toward the hollow as proof of what happens when shame replaces God. But what none of them understood was this: the Barkers did not choose their fate, they were born into it, born into a cycle sealed long before their own breath. Each deformity was not a mark of malice, but of abandonment. Each whisper of cannibalism, each fearful glance from neighbors, only pushed them deeper into silence, deeper into hunger, deeper into despair, as the candles burned low in their cabin and shadows crawled higher upon the walls. The Barkers endured. Their lives were not measured in years, but in whispers, in shame, in the endless weight of eyes that refused to look directly, and voices that refused to speak their truth aloud. And still, the bloodline carried forward, bent, broken, but alive. For tragedy, when it takes root deep enough, does not end in a single generation. It spreads, it lingers, it grows, and in the years that followed, the Barkers' Hollow would become not merely a place of dread but a legend of terror, told in tones too hushed to be casual, too fearful to be forgotten. The legend of the Barkers did not end in silence. Silence, after all, never holds forever. In the Appalachian hills, secrets rot like unburied bodies, and sooner or later, the earth gives them back. By the early 20th century, the hollow where the Barkers lived had become a place of dread. The path to their cabin was overgrown, swallowed by briars and twisting roots, as though even the land wished to conceal them. Outsiders who passed too near described a suffocating stillness, a heaviness in the air that made breathing difficult. Birds refused to sing there. The creek that wound past their home ran murky and foul-smelling, carrying with it the whispers of decay. The Barkers were fewer now. Generations of isolation had not only bent their bones, but thinned their numbers. Children born weak did not survive the winters. Mothers died in childbirth. their bodies too frail to endure the breaking of yet another malformed life into the world. The few who remained clung to existence with an animal tenacity, as if survival itself had become their only prayer. Neighbors, those who dared to call themselves such, spoke of shapes moving in the night near the Barker land, figures stooped and misshapen, drifting through the fog like spirits. Some swore they heard the sounds of gnawing carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable, like teeth grinding against bone. Hunters told tales of finding animal carcasses arranged in grotesque patterns, their flesh stripped clean, their skulls cracked open. Whether these stories were true or born of fear hardly mattered. In the minds of those who lived nearby, the Barkers had ceased to be human. They were phantoms, monsters, warnings etched in flesh. Inside the cabin, the truth was both more terrible and more human. The Barkers did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as cursed. Each child born with twisted limbs was greeted with tears, not of horror, but of mourning. Each deformity was another reminder of sin's long past choices, made by ancestors whose names had long since crumbled into silence. Yet they could not stop what had already been set in motion. Their love, their devotion, their desperate clinging to one another was what kept them alive, and what doomed them further with every union of kin. There were attempts, now and then, to break the cycle. A Barker boy once tried to leave, following a trader's wagon down the mountain road, but the world beyond the hollow recoiled at him. His gait was crooked, his jaw twisted, his eyes clouded, and the stares he endured cut sharper than knives. He returned to the cabin after only days, broken not by hunger or cold, but by shame. In the end, no Barker could truly leave. The world would not let them, and so the cycle spun on. When the last of them died, the cabin stood empty. Rain seeped through the broken roof, ivy crept through the windows, and the wind whistled through cracks like voices mourning. Neighbors avoided the land still, even when it became clear no Barker lived to haunt it. They said the soil itself was poisoned, cursed by the blood spilled into it. Children were warned never to play near the hollow, for fear they might catch the deformities like a sickness. Hunters carved crosses into the trees nearby, hoping to ward off whatever lingered there. But legends are not bound to flesh. They do not rot, as bodies do. They live on in whispers, in stories told around fires, in the uneasy silence when someone speaks the name too loud. The Barkers became more than a family. They became a ghost story, a cautionary tale. Proof, too. The superstitious minds of Appalachia, that sin takes root in the blood and grows until it bends bone, until it gnaws flesh, until it devours the soul. And even now, there are those who swear the hollow is not empty. That when the fog settles low and the night is too still, you can hear shuffling footsteps within the trees. That if you listen long enough, you will hear a voice hoarse, broken, pleading not for food, nor for company, but for release, for an end to a curse that began long before the living could remember. The Barker's tale is not just one of deformity, nor of horror. It is the story of abandonment, of human beings cut off from mercy, from kindness, from the world itself. They became mirrors, reflecting not only their own suffering, but the cruelty of those who looked away and let them rot in silence. And so their cabin rots still, in the minds of those who tell the story. The candlelight long extinguished, the shadows long dissolved. Yet the image remains, a family huddled together in the dark, twisted bodies pressed close, eyes turned inward, toward a love that was both their salvation and their doom. Their bloodline may be gone, but their story lives, crawling on through the mountains like a fog that will never lift. The tragic tale of the Barker bloodline remains, not just as legend, but as a wound Appalachia has never healed. And so the Barker name dissolves into silence, their hollow reclaimed by roots and rain, their faces remembered only in the whispers of those too afraid to forget. Their tragedy is not only of deformity, nor of horror, but of isolation, of a family abandoned until love itself became a curse. If this story has stayed with you, if the shadows of the Barkers still cling to your thoughts, let them not vanish into the forgotten corners of history. Share their tale, leave your voice in the comments below, and walk with us deeper into the haunted past of Appalachia. Subscribe, so that the next time we unearth a buried secret, you will be here to bear witness. Because some stories are too heavy to carry alone, and too dark to let die in silence.